You think the money changed them, but that's not what happened. Right now, someone in your life who has quietly built more than you know is running a calculation about you, not out of cruelty, not out of arrogance, a cold, invisible calculation that happens automatically below the surface of every dinner and every group chat and every catch-up coffee you've had in the last 2 years. And once you understand how that calculation works, you will never read their silence the same way again. You notice the disappearance before you can explain it. Someone you knew, a friend, a colleague, someone who used to be everywhere, starts showing up less than not at all. No argument, no falling out, no explanation. They just quietly stop being where everyone else is. And people talk about it. They say he changed. They say money changed him. They say she forgot where she came from. They say it like it's a character flaw, like disappearing is what happens to people when they get too far ahead of themselves and lose something essential in the process. But it isn't a flaw, it's a calculation. And the calculation has a logic that's almost impossible to argue with once you see it clearly. Let's start with what actually happens when someone's net worth crosses a certain threshold. Not the number itself, and the number is different for everyone, but the moment when the financial gap between you and your oldest circle becomes wide enough to change the texture of every interaction. It starts small, a dinner where someone makes a joke about how nice it must be, a conversation where someone asks for a favor that has a dollar sign attached to it, framed as just catching up, a group trip where the budget conversation becomes quietly uncomfortable because you're not on the same side of it anymore. None of these are dramatic. None of them are unforgivable, but each one deposits something into an account that doesn't pay interest. It just accumulates weight, and at some point the weight changes the math of showing up, not because they think they're better than anyone, because every social interaction has a cost: time, energy, emotional labor. And when the majority of your existing relationships require you to perform a version of yourself that no longer exists, the version that was broke or struggling or in the same place as everyone else, the cost of those interactions starts to exceed what they return. You can only pretend to be the old version of yourself for so long before it stops feeling like connection and starts feeling like theater. But the part that nobody tells you about, the part that changes everything, begins not with the cost of old friendships. It begins with the temperature of new ones. When you have money, the way people treat you changes. Not always, obviously. Sometimes the change is the opposite of what you'd expect. Not coldness, but warmth. Sudden warmth. More interest in what you're doing, more availability, more enthusiasm when you walk into a room. And you notice it. You notice it because you remember what the room felt like before. You remember who asked how you were when there was nothing to gain from asking. You remember who showed up when showing up cost them something. The new warmth is real. The people delivering it are probably genuine, but you've become a person it's useful to know. And useful is a different thing than loved, and you can feel the difference even when you can't prove it. This is when the silent test begins. Not consciously. You don't sit down and decide to be suspicious, but you start noticing who reaches out when you have nothing to offer, who disappears when you say no, who asks questions about your life versus questions about your access. The silent test doesn't have a clean answer. Most relationships fail it partially and pass it partially, but running it constantly, on every dinner, every message, every unexpected call, is exhausting in a way that's almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't needed to run it. And some people decide the simplest way to stop running it is to disappear from the pool of people worth testing. But even the silent test isn't what drives the deepest disappearances. What drives those is something colder and more mathematical. When you build something, a business, a portfolio, a level of wealth that required real sacrifice to reach, the work of protecting it activates what I call the arithmetic of time, not arrogance. Arithmetic. There are a finite number of hours in a week. Every hour spent maintaining a relationship that costs more than it returns is an hour not spent on something that compounds. And people who have built something from nothing understand compounding viscerally in a way that changes how they evaluate everything, including who they spend Tuesday evenings with. This is not coldness. This is what it looks like when someone has learned through actual experience that time is the only resource that doesn't come back. The people who remain in their life are the ones who add something that can't be found elsewhere. Genuine laughter, honest feedback, presence without agenda, the kind of loyalty that showed up before there was anything to be loyal to. Everyone else doesn't get cut dramatically, they just get less. Less time, less access, less priority, and from the outside, less looks exactly like gone. But there's one more layer, the one that explains why even people who want to stay connected eventually go silent. When you reach a level where people know you have money, you stop being able to be honest in public. Think about what it costs to complain when you're wealthy. Someone who makes $50,000 a year talks about a hard month, and people listen. Someone who has $5 million and talks about a hard month is dismissed immediately, often with contempt. The emotional space available to you shrinks as the number grows. You're supposed to be fine. You're supposed to be grateful. And any deviation from that is read as performance or ingratitude. So you stop talking, not because you don't have problems, because the social contract for expressing problems has been revoked, and you can feel it in every room. You can't talk about the anxiety of watching a portfolio drop. You can't talk about the loneliness that comes with a level of success that most people around you don't share. You can't talk about the fear that you'll make the wrong decision and lose everything and have to explain that to the people who were watching. All of that goes inside, and once everything goes inside, the conversations on the outside start to feel thin. Not wrong, not bad, just thin. Like talking about the weather with someone while something else entirely is happening underneath. And thin conversations over time stop being worth the calendar entry. None of this means the disappearance is right. It doesn't mean it's kind. Some of the friendships that get left behind deserve more effort. Some of the people who noticed the silence were genuinely hurt by it and didn't understand why. But it isn't what people say it is. It isn't arrogance. It isn't forgetting where you came from. It isn't money changing someone into a worse person. It's the entirely predictable result of what happens when a person's world changes dramatically and the relationships around them stay exactly the same. Something has to give. And what gives almost always is the social life that was built for a different version of the person who no longer quite exists. Here's what stays with me about all of this. The people who disappear aren't usually the ones who change the most. They're the ones who changed and stopped pretending they hadn't. The people who stay visible, who keep showing up, keep performing the old version of themselves, keep laughing at the same jokes in the same rooms, are often working harder than anyone knows just to maintain the appearance of someone who hasn't moved on. The disappearance is honest in a way that staying often isn't. If you're watching this and you're the one who disappeared or started to, you're not a bad person for needing something different than what you had. You're not wrong for noticing that some relationships were built on proximity and circumstance rather than something more durable. You're not obligated to maintain a version of your social life that no longer fits the version of your life. But here's the thing worth sitting with. The calculation that makes disappearing logical is the same calculation that, left unchecked, makes people genuinely lonely at levels of success that look from the outside like they should feel like freedom. The answer isn't to go back. The answer is to be deliberate about what you build going forward, to find and keep the people who knew you before and chose to understand who you're becoming, to build new relationships with people who are moving in the same direction. To not let the calculation run so completely that one day you look up and realize the disappearance worked perfectly and there's nobody left who knows your actual name. The intelligent millionaire who disappears from everyone's life is not a cautionary tale about greed or coldness. They're a cautionary tale about what happens when you optimize for the wrong thing for long enough. Money is not the thing worth protecting. The people who pass the silent test without knowing there was a test, the ones who were there before the number changed, who stayed without needing anything back, who showed up when showing up cost them something. Those are the ones worth occasionally breaking the disappearance for. Everything else can be rebuilt. They can't. So here's what I want you to sit with. Think of one person in your life who was there before you had anything worth being around for, before the title, before the account balance, before whatever version of success you've built or are building right now. Who passed your silent test without even knowing it existed? Write their name in the comments, or just their initials, or just tell me the story. Because the most important thing this conversation can do isn't explain why people disappear. It's remind you who's worth staying for.